Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first session of Sports and Society Dialogues. The Sports and Policy Center is a new initiative in collaboration with the Bangalore International Center, where we explore issues at the intersection of sports, law policy, and society. Our first session for today is titled Batting for Reconciliation, South Africa, Cricket, and the Challenges of Social Transformation. This session explores the issues and lessons emerging from the report of the Social Justice and Nation Building Ombudsman, appointed by Cricket South Africa in July 2021. To contribute to truth, healing, and reconciliation, the link to the report is available in your chat box for your reference. The session features our distinguished lineup of discussants. We're pleased to introduce you to the first one, Ms. Firdose Moonda, eminent cricket writer and author, and ESPN Cricinfo's Southern Africa correspondent for nearly a decade and a half. We have Dr. Ashwin Desai, one of South Africa's foremost social commentators and professor of Department of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg. And our moderator for the session is Dr. Chandan Gowda, sociologist and the Ramakrishna Hegde Chair Professor of Decentralization and Development at the Institute of Social and Economic Change, Bengaluru. Before we begin our session, I'd like to request all our viewers that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box and our speakers will try to address them at the end of the session. Over to you, Dr. Gowda.
Thank you, Yuvita. I'd like to thank Sports Law and Policy Center, Bangalore, for organizing this discussion, which is valuable in my view, BIC for hosting it. The Social Justice and Nation Building Report, I mean, this phrase is still very fresh, despite words having been around for so long. Well, released in mid-December, and the two panelists with us today have been close observers of the sporting scene in general and have been followed the making of this report and its fallout also very closely. So it's really fortunate that both of them were able to be here with us this evening. The report grapples with an issue of paramount importance, that's racial discrimination, and how that manifests in something like sport, which is given as the metaphor of the level playing field. But invariably, a discussion of sport is not just a local discussion of sport alone. It has crucial consequences for how we think about public philosophy, and a discussion of this report, in my view, is also a discussion of the evolving philosophy of public democracies and the challenges of trying to overcome exclusion and discrimination in societies with long histories of discrimination like South Africa and so many other societies around the world. How do we remedy them? What do we do when we know something unhealthy is being manifested? I look forward to learning from the two panelists this evening, Professor Ashwin Desai and the sports journalist Firdose Moonda. The first question is to you, Firdose. Why the need for this report? I mean, what is the issue of diversity challenges in South African cricket?
I suppose the need for the report, and first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm a little bit tired. I've been up the whole night covering New Zealand against South Africa, so maybe not at my finest. But the need for the report, I think, is actually come 3 decades late. And what we needed was something like this to happen when unity took place, when we had the board for sport of colour and the white board unite. And I suppose we can even debate whether it really was a true unification. And that's where we should have really had this process. Unfortunately, it didn't happen then. South Africa was excited to get back into international sport. It was also a bit of a pacification for kind of like letting the white minority feel as though they had some grip on something that they still considered theirs. And it was just completely overlooked. And so what we had towards the middle of 2020, when the Black Lives Matter movement collided with sport and we saw England and West Indies take a knee, was a discussion in South African cricket that went on for 18 months about whether or not our national teams would take a knee. And it really seemed like the most ridiculous thing, because the country, which was really the last legalized bastion of white supremacy and one in which sport had been so, and cricket and rugby in particular had been so dominated by the issue of racial prejudice, were even debating whether we should show solidarity with anti-racism, boggled a lot of our minds. In the process of the team going through their processes of making no gestures at all, and then raising a fist, and then giving themselves options, and eventually being ordered to take a knee, the old Cricket South Africa board, so a board that resigned towards the end of 2020 and then was replaced by an interim board and has now been replaced by another board, decided that they would have this process in order to, first of all, give former players and even current players, although not many took up the offer, the opportunity to go and share their stories of racial discrimination. And then also to look at whether reparations, in the beginning, it was a process of whether reparations could be paid and whether that would involve money that was not earned for match fees or for contracts that were denied. None of that was really clarified. In the process, no reparations have taken place, and I don't think any will. But we are seeing things like the national head coach, Mark Boucher, facing a disciplinary hearing. So the process was started by the old board. It was aimed at addressing the issues that came up after South Africa went through this thing of whether they should or shouldn't take a knee. And then the new board followed through with it.
Okay, thank you. Professor Desai, we know that the format of the hearings was a clear reminder of the great truth and reconciliation meetings that we saw happen in South Africa in the mid-90s. And you've written a book on post-apartheid cricket. So I was wondering if you could place this report in a longer historical perspective and help us locate it that way.
Okay, I hope I can do this shortly, in a sense. So firstly, in South Africa, it's become half a joke. Whenever there's an issue, we appoint a commission of inquiry, and knowing that the commission inquiry will probably go nowhere. And this, South Africa is replete from the beginnings of colonialism with commissions of inquiries. Because it gives a certain sort of legitimacy to those who have power, ironically. And so forget the TRC, I can regale you with a critique of the TRC. But just we had the ANC government setting up a Marikana commission into Marikana killings where 34 miners were shot in the back of the head, literally. And that really went nowhere. And so whenever I see, they say Joseph Goebbels, when he heard the word culture, he wanted to vomit. When I heard the word commission of inquiry, I want to vomit. Because for those who are lawyers here in the audience, and I'm no lawyer, it's a real bastardization of processes. Because why? Because you can come and say anything you want to. You're not cross-examined. You can have selective memory about things, and it becomes part in this world of instant social media. You yourself can be blasphemed. You can be cancelled by people giving evidence that turns out to be just rubbish. And so I hesitate about commissions of inquiries, and especially this cricket one. I was just reading through the commission. It's 252 pages or something. And then one of the players there, Roger Telemarcus, says, hey, man, I was selected for the 2007 World Cup semi-final. And then I was told by the coach that the ANC government said they got to have he's colored, they got to have an African. So they put Makai and Chini in there. And I don't know what made me go and look at this. And that's in the report. And I went and looked at the scorecard. Of course, Andre Nel played. Makai and Chini didn't play. It's just rubbish that is then put into a set of so-called evidences. And so we need to firstly start by questioning these forums called commissions of inquiries and what happens there. Because as you know, and especially with cricket, what constitutes racism in cricket? I'm a captain of a team and, suddenly the pitch is taking spin. I don't bowl the white fast bowler. Am I anti-white? I'm making a nuanced, subtle decision about cricket. And yet I've been told that I have to have equality of opportunity. Bowl each racial group in South Africa for the set number of overs. My God. And what happens when, there's only 4 racial groups and 50 overs? What do I do? So this is a Monty Python-esque mess, and it should be called like that.
Professor, very quickly, how else do you think this matter could have been addressed?
Well, firstly, as Firdose said, really, do you want to, appoint a commission of inquiry, 30 years later, when memories are selective, when you made certain decisions? Now, just think about it. We have an overwhelmingly black cricket board. We have an overwhelmingly black national selection committee. And when I use the word black, I mean colored, Indian, and African. And yet, for example, we still have a quota system in the national team, which we say is based on merit. If it's based on merit, why have a quota system? I can understand when all the selectors were white or 5 of the 6 selectors are white, there would be prejudice against black people. But if the majority of selectors overwhelming are black, why have the quota system? So firstly, it's really trying to win a test match 30 years later.
A factual thing. When did the quota system fall in place? And maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what this is.
Okay. Well, firstly, South Africa has had a quota system since day one, in a sense that during colonial and apartheid times, there was a quota system. They were all white. If you're a great black player like Basil de Oliveira, well, you had to go to England to play, right? So what happens is that when as Firdose said, when we went into international cricket in 1992 for the first time at the World Cup, of course, the best cricketers were white because black cricket was decimated, destroyed. And so it was always said that we go into international cricket, money will flow down and we'll have black players. And black players only really came through in 1998, and that's because of political interventions. The 3 black players that came through at that time were Herschel Gibbs, Paul Adams, and Mackay Tini. Of course, they were world class, and they would only have been given an opportunity because of being forced upon by political decisions. And then that inaugurated this idea of quotas, because basically white people were using the most bizarre ways in which to exclude black players. So Hashim Amla was said that he had poor technique and that he had to bat like Graham Pollock to get in, the story. So in that sense, quotas were introduced, but they're past their sell-by date, right? Number one. And number two, this has to be seen. I just want to talk about this racism thing. I mean, part of the problem then is just not a South African thing, as we say. In Yorkshire right now, as we found out with Azim Rafiq, the kind of everyday racism is even more insidious. And at some stage, when you have another seminar, I want to talk about how, by India being so dominant at the ICC and in world cricket, how India, through its own color codings, might give cover to racisms in cricket, both in South Africa and globally, and how they are playing the part of a kind of new imperial power. And I don't want to detract from that. But I think, so quotas are that in the Indian team, there are 11 Brahmins who come from St. Lawrence or whatever school that he is every year, day in and day out. And now there's a quota to say at least 2 of those players have to be Dalits. So that's the base in which quotas have come about. Now they've been broken up. At first, it was just how many black players you play. Now it's how many colored and Indian players and how many black African players are set down in stone that have to be selected.
But you're saying this must be given up because it's actually working against colored and black players. Is that what you meant? Now that there's no longer need for quota system because the merit system is working just fine?
Of course, every player in the pro tiers, in fact, they might even have to maybe perform at a greater level. But if you just think of the players, and this is just not made up, Kagiso Rabada was the number one fast bowler in the world. Themba Bavuma is a captain of the national team, made an incredible century at Newlands, and so we go on. Just Keegan Peterson at the age of 28 coming in and playing against India and really giving your bowlers, the so-called world-class bowlers that you have, quite a hiding, on the field of play. So, so what it does is it burdens these black players. There's 2 things happens. It burdens with these black players with the idea that they're there because of the quota system. Number one. Number 2, it's a game in play that burdens the players and destroys black players often, because to meet the quota, even if Kagiso Rabada is going to be rested, you might not want to rest him because you as a selector want to meet your quota and overplay him or play him in all formats of the game and so on. So it's not necessary that way. So my point is worth a debate, just like Black Lives Matter in South Africa is worth a debate. It's a United States thing where black people are in the minority. Black Lives Matter in South Africa is also sponsored by the ANC government, which is killing black people. This is a majority black government, which then wants to stand and say, hey, look at Black Lives Matter. It's a ridiculous, it's a ridiculous notion to be unnuanced and not debated. And that's what intellectual life is about. It's not to be problematic. It's to be a pinch hitter in a 20-over game. You don't come and block like Sunil Gavaskar for 20 overs. You hit the bloody ball.
Thank you. Firdose, coming back to the report, can you comment on the process by which the report came to be assembled? I mean, sorry, stepping down from the emotional pitch that.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Wow, Ashwin's definitely woken me up.
A comment on the process. The ombudsman. How was that? How was this person picked on the reference? These sort of preliminary things about the report.
So the ombudsman was appointed by that previous board that I mentioned, and for several reasons, the process was delayed by months and months, one of which was that the ombudsman had other engagements at the African Human Rights Court in Tanzania. And then when the process began, submissions were opened, and it was open to anybody who wanted to provide a written or oral testimony. Most provided written testimonies and followed by oral testimonies. Some people provided only written, and some people then went and appeared in front of the ombudsman. Mm-hmm. The proceedings were live streamed on a YouTube channel, and the ombudsman was assisted by two legal representatives from a big law firm in this country who didn't take on the role of cross-examination, but the way they phrased it was that they would ask questions for clarification. And in listening to the proceedings, those questions were angled in very obvious directions. Mm. And the questions were often about the people in power, especially about white people in power, and clearly often directed towards the actions of the director of cricket, Graham Smith, who you'll know as the former Test captain, and the head coach, Mark Boucher. And then there was a period which started off as 2 weeks and I think became possibly 2 months for anybody who was adversely implicated in testimony to come and provide a response. Again, there was no obligation to do so. Several people did provide responses. A.B. de Villiers, for example, provided a written response. So did Mark Boucher. Jacques Fall, the former CEO of Cricket South Africa, went and gave an oral testimony response in which he admitted that at one point Cricket South Africa in 2020 was too white. So there was respondents, and then there was a period where the ombudsman went through everything and then compiled the report. And yeah, the report is pretty problematic in a lot of ways. I mean, the one thing that happened, which I think needs to be mentioned, is that 5 players who accepted guilt in contriving to fix matches in South Africa used up days and days and days of the ombudsman's time and many days then of rebuttal from the anti-corruption unit to talk about being discriminated against when there was absolutely no discrimination there. It was a legal process conducted under the ICC's auspices, and they accepted their role in what had happened, and this was in the 2015-16 season, and then tried to divert the process to talk about discrimination when there was none in that instance. There was also no, as Ashwin mentioned, no kind of going through of there was no cross-examination, right? So when someone like a Roger Telemarcus says, I didn't play and so played instead, nobody went and checked those things. And there are a few instances of that, I don't know if some of it's memory or some of it is kind of superimposing one thing onto the other, or some of it is just making things up because that's what you feel you want to make up at that point in time. And now the subsequent process is that Mark Boucher will face a disciplinary hearing where Paul Adams, I guess, will be asked to testify, but again, there'll be no obligation on him to testify. And that will be a legal process, whereas the SJN was not a legal process. And it was also not mandated that Cricket South Africa follow the recommendations of the ombudsman. I mean, in the end, he didn't really make any recommendations. And he said all his findings were tentative, which is quite problematic in that, he's made tentative finding of racism against people. And I think being labeled a racist is sort of like being labeled pregnant. So like you either are or you aren't. And to have this hanging over people is what is causing a lot of angst. So it's really polarized the game. And I still think it was a necessary process. And I still think it's important for people to be able to tell their stories. And some people like Paul Adams, I think, made really good use of that in that he didn't go in an accusatory way. And in fact, what he said was, I'm not here for people to lose their jobs. I want us to learn from what we did wrong. And what he really spoke about, which we haven't addressed at all, is this culture of toxic masculinity that exists in our sport, that comes from the schools, that comes from elite schools, and that fosters bullying and hierarchy and all the things that colonialism imposes on societies. And I just don't think we're addressing that enough, and we're not talking about it enough. Why do we have a fines meeting culture? Why do we have this very patriarchal system under which teams operate? And when will it stop? And I think that's what where the discussion should go next.
Firdose, you mentioned that the proceedings against Mark Bachelor would be more legal. Would that be part 2 of this report making, or is it a separate process? Because this report is called an interim report.
Yeah, it's called interim, but there will be no other report. So Cricket South Africa themselves are baffled as to why it's called interim report. Yeah. And the proceedings against Mark Boucher are Cricket South Africa's own follow-up to receiving the report, and that's a disciplinary hearing. So that will be taking place between Mark Boucher's lawyers, Cricket South Africa's lawyers. They've charged him officially. They're calling for his dismissal, and that hearing takes place in May. There's a separate process with arbitration agreements that are being drawn up with Graham Smith, and that will not be a disciplinary hearing, but it's happening behind closed doors. So those are the 2 follow-ups that we have at the moment.
Yeah. This question, is to both of you. How when it's being live streamed, the proceedings, and it's being talked about in the press, etc. What is the local reception like? How are people responding to the unfolding proceedings?
Well, I watched a lot of it, so
yes.
I will start by saying, first of all, you need to have an internet connection to be able to watch these things, and the majority of our population will not have a stable enough internet connection and enough data to watch. So the numbers for people who were watching the videos were around 6,000, 7,000. I think the Paul Adams one hit the most, which was about 12,000. It's not a lot of people. Instead, what people were relying on were the reports that came out of it. And of course, you needed to watch pretty much all of it to be able to compile something that made sense. There were, it's media, right? There were headline grabbers. There were things that were written that didn't entirely always reflect what was going on. There were allegations made. So from a legal perspective, for example, as someone who works for a global news organization and we follow the libel laws in the UK, we couldn't name anyone, even if victims went there, or I suppose people went there to testify and said, Mr. X did this to me. We couldn't name that person unless we had confirmed it ourselves, which made it also quite difficult. The reception was I found, quite outrageous on both sides. I found that we had a lot of defensiveness from the white side. We had prominent white reporters, to be honest, coming out and saying that they needed to, and contextualizing the racial slurs and making a lot of excuses for what had been said to people, and then also trying to argue the cricketing side of things. And like Ashwin said, we don't often make decisions that are only cricket or only race-based, and we can't find a balance between these two. So it's true that in a cricket team, you need to pick people to do particular things. And if you've only got a very small selection of batsmen of color, what do? You can't field 8 bowlers and 3 batters. It's not really going to work. So that's kind of where the debate got taken in one direction. And then the other direction was an absolute outpouring of hurt, anger, frustration, disappointment from people of color. You had lots of people come forward saying, I played club cricket in the late 90s in whatever part of South Africa, and this is what was happening to me. So those stories came out as well on social media. Also, this took place during the height of the 3rd wave of the pandemic here, and most of us were at home. We were not really seeing each other. We were only interacting on the internet, which made it worse because we were able to spew stuff knowing that I won't have to see this person's face, and that didn't really help us. And I think it's just resulted in our cricket being absolutely polarized. I speak as a member of the cricket media, and I attend most of the national team's games live. There are sections of the media that no longer speak to each other because of what happened at the SJN. There are sections of the public that are no longer happy to be around each other, and we haven't had fans in the stadiums until very recently, so I don't know what that's going to be like. But it has really ripped and exposed and torn us to pieces, I think.
And if you can speak of the political class separately, what kind of response has that section in the politicians in power? Have they taken an interest in the proceedings?
Yeah, I mean, the sports minister gave a short statement at the beginning and end of the SJN proceedings and supported the proceedings. And the last political, there hasn't been too much, but Cricket South Africa presented at the Parliamentary Sports Portfolio Committee, which is like the body that keeps the minister in check, I suppose. And that was 2 weeks ago, where they did go through the report. So you had MPs asking questions. Our MPs are woefully ignorant about much of what goes on. And so one of them was asking why Mark Butcher wasn't suspended. And Mark Butcher was very distraught when he heard that he was involved, given that he has nothing to do with any of this. So we did have some very strange questions being asked. In general, they wanted to know why Mark Boucher had not been suspended. And Cricket South Africa said that on legal advice, they were told that they could not suspend him and that he should instead go with the team to New Zealand, which is where he is. They wanted to know why that had happened, and also why there was not a salary equalizing between white and black players. And this is a bit complicated because basically players are paid match fees in addition to their retainers. And obviously, the more you play, the more match fees you earn. And there were some instances of like Aaron Pangiso, for example, who went through the entire 2015 World Cup without playing a game, mostly for good reason, because Imran Tahir was in the side and was the top spinner at the time. And we can generally only play one spinner in South Africa, but also the World Cup was in Australia and New Zealand, so conditions dictated such. But there was an opportunity perhaps to play Pangiso at the end when South Africa had qualified and their last fixture was against the UAE and they chose not to. So Pangiso didn't earn any match fees on that tour. Mm-hmm. And that results in this imbalance between the payments. And you'll often find that there are, particularly historically, there'd be black players or players of color sitting on the bench for more extended periods of time, not earning the same amounts of money. And I think Cricket South Africa attempted to explain this to Parliament. I don't think they really succeeded. And the question just remained in terms of what are you going to do to make sure people earn more money? And that was kind of where it was left. So beyond that, besides the minister being pro-transformation and the politicians not knowing what's going on, we haven't heard too much.
Professor Desai, I mean, what do you experience? I had a question of Firdose, but I'll just give her a little break. In terms of, I know you didn't you didn't think very much about this exercise of, this hearings and the report making, but what possible consequences do you see coming out of it for South African cricket?
Yeah. Look, I'm not saying that there's nothing in the exercise, and I agree with Firdose is that firstly about the journalism in cricket, right? Many of us have raised these matters of racism, for a long time, and all you'd get is heaps of abuse from white journalists. It's just abuse, and at that time, I must say that black cricketers didn't support us who were raising the racism. They just kept quiet, and one can understand why. And black administrators didn't raise these issues or give you any backup. And you start to think maybe you're a crazy guy. Maybe you're just making up all these things in your own head, right? So I think there's two things to be said. Firstly, when I was watching it, one of the things occluded in the whole thing is that this gave an opportunity for the corrupt cricket administrators who have ruined Cricket South Africa, who have abused its resources. The CEO himself pitches up to give evidence about racism when he himself, was suspended from his job for abuse of all kinds of processes and things. That's number one. And that was an important thing.
Could you just repeat what
you get these. Saying that one of the things
we
that
could hear you for
was
a little
almost
while.
rendered invisible in this process.
If you could just...
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I'll say one of the things that we must take cognizance of is the fact that amidst this talk of the social justice aspect, one of the crucial aspects that have not been highlighted is the sheer corruption at the level of the higher echelons of Cricket South Africa. And the very people often came to give evidence there, crying racism, were themselves suspended from the organization because of what they did in terms of the finances. The second part, just to pick up on what Firdose was saying, you were asking, what do politicians say? What can politicians say? This report is an indictment of them, not of cricket in many ways. Because what the report was saying is that sport and cricket in black townships has gone backwards. There are no pitches. The schools are in disaster. We don't even have proper functioning toilets. People don't have basic food. And yet Cricket South Africa is berated and is challenged and is taken to task for not producing cricketers from townships, when the very government that is saying that is destroying the school infrastructure as we speak. So it's quite something that, within 30 years of liberation, already the ruling party is seen as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And that, I think, Advocate Dumiza and Sabeza, maybe that's what lawyers do. You just stick to some script. Doesn't even go through. He knows that stuff. He knows who is culpable in many of these things. Who is culpable in spatial apartheid being still in place in South Africa? Cricket South Africa? This is the South African government which built reconstruction development houses far out of town. So for the Ministers of Sport, what they do is they grandstand. What they do is they can't meet their own targets in almost everything that they set, building houses, building schools, giving people food parcels. And they use these things to cover up their own treachery in the everyday lives of South Africans.
Thank you for this. Firdose, coming back to you, what did the ombudsman, recommend as possible remedies, to manage the kinds of problems they were able to discover in terms of, what are the steps? Although they're not legally enforceable, what do they think needs to be done?
Yeah, that's really where the issue comes in that he didn't recommend much at all. What he recommended was that Cricket South Africa look into an independent investigation on the conduct of Mark Boucher and Graham Smith, which is what they've done, or what they're doing with the disciplinary hearing and with the arbitration agreements against Smith. He didn't recommend anything he recommended a clearer selection policy. And I think South Africa's selection policy is clear. It is sometimes not well communicated. For example, there's a test match going on in New Zealand now, and Zubair Hamza has been picked ahead of Ryan Rickleton, who was in the squad. Ryan Rickleton is white, Zubair Hamza is of color. Zubair Hamza has not had the season Ryan Rickleton has had. Rickleton averages over 100 and Hamza averages 30-something. And it's pretty clear why Hamza has been picked. What we're not getting is a message from the selectors saying, we have made a transformation call and we are picking Zubair Hamza for this test match because we want to meet our targets. Instead, they're saying, we picked him because we picked him. That was the one answer we got. And the other one was we picked him because he has more experience. He's played 5 test matches and Rickleton's played none. So he does have more experience, but I mean, it's not very much. So there's not really been clear recommendations from the ombudsman, which I think was really disappointing, in that Cricket South Africa spent 7.5 million rand, which is $500,000, on this report. And didn't actually receive any clear guidelines. There's no steps outlined. There's nothing to say this is what needs to be done in order for cricket to become either more transformed, more inclusive, or any of that. The ombudsman lamented the state of facilities in the townships. And, that, I don't know, that doesn't always lie on Cricket South Africa. As Ashwin said, that also lies on government. And we do have other problems in this country and running water, electricity, providing food, housing, all of that, I'm sure it comes before providing cricket facilities. But those things are not for Cricket South Africa to solve right now at this moment. And I don't think that they can. And I think what they do, they've got these development hubs in various parts of the country. We've got mini cricket that's being played in various parts of the country. The issue, I guess, is also in schools that are not part of the elite school system, which don't have cricket facilities. But again, that's not on Cricket South Africa to go and build cricket pitches in those places. It's going to be on the schools themselves, government, all sorts of other organizations. And so that all of that went completely unaddressed. And really, I think that's the biggest disappointment from the report, is that it took months. It was very emotionally draining for people on all sides. And the ombudsman seemed as though he was really thinking about possibly recommending things, and things that he was saying suggested that there was a process happening. But then when it came to the final report, it really didn't say anything.
When we step back and look at, the question of discrimination in cricket, in other cricketing countries. It's almost a remarkable coincidence that Azim Rafiq in England came out with his testimony about what had happened to him, and that's opened up a big discussion there. In Scotland is trying to look into that. Is forming a committee to look into that. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of what the South African experience may have to offer England and Scotland or any other country that may want to, address it in the best possible spirit of trying to, in an honest confrontation and commitment to moving on?
I think they have to have some.
Yeah, you carry on first, Firdose. You carry.
Sorry.
No, go.
I think they have to have some form of cross-examination or some form of, I almost feel it's hard to ask people who say they've experienced racism for receipts because, where are they going to provide them from? But there does need to be some way of being able to check and verify and at least get corroboration, if not cross-examination on some of the points made, because I think that's really where the SJN fell short. I think it's a process worth having and everybody should have it. In England should have it, Australia should have it, India should have it, everybody should have it. Maybe it'll be a slight time waster, as Ashwin says, and it may not lead to anything. If anything, it just gives people space to say something and to get things off their chest and maybe to think about their own experiences, which in Paul Adams's case, he hadn't thought about it. He had his girlfriend come up to him one day and say, why do they call you this nickname, which I won't say on this forum. And only years later did he realize there was actually something really wrong with that. And, there's a whole subculture about fines meetings, which we can talk about another time. But I think it will be necessary. And if people are to learn from the South African experience, there needs to be more time. So the ombudsman completely ran out of time. It's a costly process, so that it needs to be able to be well funded. And then I think there should be some kind of oversight into following through with whether there are recommendations made, whether there's a process outlined. There needs to be some kind of oversight on following through with that. Otherwise, you end up with what we've ended up with, and maybe the questions will address that. But it's a mess really going forward.
Because I remember. Please go on.
Chandan, my thing is that one of the things we do, we've come on for 300 years of particular ways of thinking about race and so on, and we're pretty good in the way people are writing, people are taking this up, the debates. There is there's some of us have been empowered because. We no more just marginal figures only, nutcases on the side. And sometimes South Africans, we can rise to the occasion. And I think people need to check themselves now and they need to raise these things. And those immediate racisms in the dressing room, I think are going to be on the decline, on the back foot. The structural inequalities are going to be there. That's why the hearings are about social justice. It's about preferential treatment. It's about equity, not just about equal treatment in strictly legal terms. And so that kind of thing in the dressing room, I can tell you now, mark vouchers and so on are on terms. And I think I'm positive about that even in the under 19 teams and so on, progressively, even white commentators who always use white role models. So if they have a black player, they'll say, he's our, Sean Pollock, or he's our Jonty Rhodes, as if black people never played this game ever and write us out of history. Well, we've written ourselves back into history and said we played this game, for as long as white people have played this game in South Africa, and we have our heroes and heroines, and you can't ignore us. So all that is happening. That's the good news. I think other countries are behind here. Just listening to the former chair of Yorkshire Cricket and all these other fuddy-duddies, whose racism has been normalized and their classism has been normalized. I think it forces them into the public domain, and there's something about us being able to interact, quarrel with each other. And those very traditional journalists, I won't name them on here, that, because the Indian public seems to love them, always puts them in the Indian wisdom and so on. They as if they're living in some, Alice in Wonderland, as if apartheid didn't happen and apartheid doesn't exist in the present. But I think India, for example, needs to learn a lesson, as if yours prejudices, yours casteism, your color codings don't exist, it's some that kind of thing. And why India is important, I would think, is that the IPL is a game changer in many ways, because many of these players couldn't be bothered about playing for South Africa. Why should they bother? They can make 20 million rand from the IPL. They can make 2 million rand from CSA, and still be a victim in many ways. So so I hope this is it focuses on those countries and the way in which cricket often lives off and reinforces prejudice, and because it's all dressed in white, it gives a cover, as you said earlier, to the level playing field. And I think in that sense, our vibrant debate about race, our confrontation of race, our ability to go in public and talk about the humiliations that we faced and our fathers and mothers faced openly, without seeing it as an indictment on ourselves, about us being able to get our stories into national papers, get onto the national TV, open up the debates about this, is just so bloody brilliant from 1992. Somehow we put these people on the back foot. Now we got to really skittle them.
Firdose, if you can, or even Professor Desai could address this. I mean, we've been focusing on cricket, but what about rugby, the other big game in South Africa? I mean, how are there comparisons to be offered there?
Definitely. I think the big difference, of course, is that the national rugby side has won 3 World Cups, and people tend to like it when the team is winning. So that has helped them a lot. And the last World Cup victory came with an Afrikaans coach and a Black African captain. And for some reason, they do seem to have got their transformation in the recent past better. I mean, the history of rugby is riddled with racism. And there's so many examples and stories of coaches and administrators and even people who are still involved today who have very known histories of racial bias. But they've somehow managed to get this recent last maybe 3-4 years, they've got a very transformed team with different backgrounds. Everybody's in love with them because you've got the Makazolo Mapimpi, who comes from a very small village, who, when they asked him to put up pictures of people who meant something to him or people who are important to him to make up his jersey number, he just only put up a collage of himself because he didn't have any family, he didn't have any close friends. And it was actually quite a heartbreaking story. But you've got that playing alongside, the really big money guys, the ones who've come from the best schools and have had the best opportunities and whose fathers and grandfathers played for the Springboks. And they're playing together. What goes on behind closed doors there, I don't know. If you watch the Chasing the Sun documentary, you're led to believe that they're all enjoying Rassie Erasmus's jokes and his drinking sessions with his bulldog or whatever it is that he's doing these days on social media, and just living his best life, and that they're very harmonious. They don't take a knee. They haven't been asked about taking a knee. And the debate just seems to have gone past them. I think because I'm not an expert on rugby, but in my understanding of things, when Rassie Erasmus took over and went to the team and said, our goal will be that we will both win and transform, and they will not be mutually exclusive, they took that on pretty seriously. And the rugby team is fairly transformed. And its transformation seems to have happened easier than the cricket teams in some ways. So I'm not saying rugby mustn't have a procedure like this, and who knows what ugliness will be revealed if it does, but they're definitely in a better space now than cricket is. Cricket is also cricket's administrative issues have been so public. They've lost so much money, they lost so much ground, they tumbled down the world rankings. And when all of those things collided, it ended up, bringing this to the surface as well.
So Chandan, I must say,
yes.
I just finished a book that looks at the history of Black rugby in the Eastern Cape. And one of the things we do, not about the present, is to show that Siya Kolisi, the captain of the Springboks, is not an invention of whites. It's not because he went to a white school and they constructed a player. In fact, in the early 1900s, one of the person who started rugby, one of the big clubs in the Eastern Cape, was a Kolisi. The person who kicked a penalty in 1937 in a game between Eastern Province and Transvaal was a Kolisi. Kolisi have come from over a century of playing rugby. And I think one of the ways we change the debate in this country and work hard at changing this debate is to show there was something like another history that was written out And that's what's important to us, because it gives us a sense. Even in cricket, whenever the commentators come on South African commentary, they think that the only time they talk about official records is the white Springboks, and they talk about history as white history. So Themba Bavuma is a new cricketer, Hashim Amla is a new cricketer, and yet it's we need to dig up these histories. We need to tell these histories. Why is it important? Because it forces down the throats of these unreconstructed racist and colonial thinkers, that they have to contend with this history. It's like saying that I'm a political commentator in India, but I only know the history of the Congress Party, or only know the history of the BJP. Is ridiculous. We have the top commentators in this country who only know white history of sport. They have no idea of black history, and they say it to us. So that's the kind of fight. Sierra James was right. It's about what goes on beyond the boundary. And many of us who can't hold a cricket bat, we never could, and we can't anymore, can still bat in ways that change the nature of the game. And that's what's happening in South Africa. That's what's great about South Africa, is that this way in which we are digging away at this privilege and unearned privilege often, and putting in the public eye all the time this incredible history, despite colonialism and apartheid, the great history we have around seeing sport as a way in which we liberate our beings, our very soul, and many of us love the game. They love the game, not just as a report. I just got the feeling from this report, by the way, these guys, there's nothing about cricket. You can feel it. When somebody gets a card and sends it to you from Valentine's Day and copies somebody else's poem, you know it. But when it's your poem, even it's not too good, the poem, there's some feeling in you, that it was written to me as an original. And that's why even in the De Villiers issue, when he's just been blasphemed, it's a great cricketer. In that game, he made the game in which he's been called a racist, he made 119 from 61 balls. South Africa put on 438 runs against India in the 5th ODI. Rabada, I think, got 4 in 7 overs. He got 4 for 41 as a fast bowler. So and it was 2-2, and we beat you guys 3-2 in a historic occasion. All that has been written out of history because De Villiers didn't choose Kaya Zondo, he chose Dean Elgar. I think that's important. But sometimes we also like this idea of prevailing against you guys on your home turf in an artificially prepared wicket for spinners and finishing you all off. And that's what sport is about at the end of the day. It's not a legal case only. It's about emotion, feeling.
I think it's a gentleman's sport. You disagree with the metaphor?
Ask Virat Kohli about being a gentleman, crying about, DRS or something. I'm sorry, I forgot. You'll never criticize your gods in India. Crying like a baby about DRS in South Africa. You are certainly no gentleman.
Well, thank you both very much for giving us such a rich sense for the situation and the cricketing situation in South Africa, and the discussions that have emerged in recent weeks. Very valuable. I think it's already making, I'm sure, the listeners as well as I think about possible sources of discrimination in our own case, in terms of both selection procedures as well as recruitment channels. Speaking in the broader social sense of how is talent discovered. A question that people have intuitively known, but I must share this in a manner of fellow sociologists note sharing. I don't think there's a single book on sports in India which maps how recruitment happens. What are the criteria by which people get picked? You have books on sports, but not an academic treatment of that tries to map out the institutional mechanisms whereby teams get picked and etc. to the failure on the part of the university in that regard. But thank you very much, both of you, for this wonderful discussion. Now we have about 25 minutes remaining for interacting with the audience, and there are a few questions that they've raised in the chat box, and I think Yogita is going to lead us through those questions. Yogita?
Thank you, Chandan. I think the first question that we have for our speakers is from Hayden Opie, who asks, what questions in this area should university researchers be looking at?
Well, I'm just, one of the things I'm very intrigued about is this idea, we all write about this thing called globalization and how, for me, like how cricket is fundamentally changing, but it's putting a strain on this question of the national team. And the IPL being an example, you got these players who are global, they break through boundaries. Chris Gale, you don't have to worry about a national team anymore. And what are the consequences of this incredible commodification? Because even in soccer, if you don't play for your national team, then you don't get a work permit to go and play, or the FIFA doesn't allow you to play for the Premier League in the United Kingdom. But it seems in cricket that you're able to completely de-link yourself from the nation state and earn probably quite a fabulous living. So, that's one area for me is quite incredible. The second area is as Chandan was saying, is these levels of exclusions that are taking place in the game. But enough said. Maybe academic researchers should do other things than worry about cricket.
Thank you, Professor Desai. Moving to the next question, we have one from Janardhan Pashupati, who asks, what role do you see for Cricket South Africa board moving forward into the future? And do you think this should be addressed at an ICC level, especially by the big three?
I think Cricket South Africa's board needs to appoint a CEO, which they have not done for the last almost year, and which a functional organization cannot operate without a CEO, and just needs to start doing what they're there to do, which is these, very clear roles which are just not being fulfilled. In terms of the actual race conversation, there is talk of a permanent ombudsman being appointed and some sort of setup where complaints can be received on allegations of discrimination in future. I don't know if that's something they're looking into. I don't think the ICC can address something like this, because the ICC is a member-run organization that basically does what, if we're honest, the most powerful members and the most powerful member is India tells them to do. And so they're not really able to go and look into, first of all, individual countries' affairs, unless the government is interfering in the board, like in Zimbabwe's case when they were banned. But then there are many other cases where the government interferes with the board, often in Sri Lanka, where the board then does not get banned. So I don't think that the ICC is actually able to go and look into any of this on an individual level, whether they can, they've got an anti-discrimination policy in place. I don't know if it does any good. And they can obviously sort their own house out if there's any discrimination taking place inside the ICC. But in terms of member countries, I don't think there's much they can do.
Thank you, Ms. Moonda. We have another question from Ramchandra Adamamni, who asks, does this mean politics control sports in South Africa? I think this was the beginning of our conversation when we were speaking about the context.
So say that again, Yogita.
Does politics control sports in South Africa?
I think it's not. No, it doesn't control sport in terms of some political parties able to foist its people upon Cricket South Africa, and only if you're a member of the ANC will you be in Cricket South Africa. I think it was the challenges that Cricket South Africa faced is that there was this whole debate in South Africa is that the presidents of the cricket unions formed Cricket South Africa. And often they defended their provincial fiefdoms rather than seeing a way of thinking about the game as a whole. And they went for an independent set of independent board. But what happens with the independent board is that many of them are de-linked from the everyday issues that confront cricket in South Africa. So we're still debating what is the best way to have a form of governance. But what in a way impacts on Cricket South Africa is that they often thought, especially under the first boards, like under the kind of tutorship of Ali Bakr, that in a way they could de-link themselves and do their own thing aside from the political temperature of the country. I think that time has passed, that cricket is accountable and that cricket has to think about the national psyche now. And the national psyche is about saying, hey, where there's racism, you confront it. Where there's racism, you push back. Where there's racism, you're going to be called out. And so in that sense, the politics is quite trespassed into cricket.
Thank you, Professor Desai. We have one last question from Chandan Pashupati, who asks, what will be the impact of this process on the near future for South African cricket and also in the long-term future?
In the near future, what we can say with a fair amount of certainty is that the Director of Cricket, Graham Smith, will not be renewing his contract and his position will be advertised. And that could be catastrophic for South African cricket because of someone like Smith's relationship with Saurav Ganguly, we were able to host India for 3 test matches and 4 ODIs and make something like 300 million rand, which if that hadn't happened, cricket in this country would have had to fundamentally restructure itself because of the money that's been lost over the pandemic and with Australia not coming and with previous India tours being cut. And I'm not saying that in any way that we should now anoint Graham Smith the great god of cricket in this country, but he does have a good international reputation and he does seem to command respect by big players in places that South Africa needs respect to be commanded. You know, the ICC is one place where South Africa's status has just crashed. And whereas they used to be important in decision making, they're not even consulted about a lot of things anymore. And people just don't regard them as having any integrity. They also don't know a lot of them. And you know, that may be a consequence of some people just haven't had exposure to the game at the highest level. And so they were not given the opportunity to become a Graham Smith. Or it may just be that some of them are fat cats that are interested in things other than cricket, which is what we saw with Thabang Maroe, the former CEO. So in the near future, the process has meant, and probably Mark Boucher, even if he wins his disciplinary hearing, is unlikely to stay on. And so that means that the national team will be without a coach. And I don't know of any very immediate replacement for him. I can't think of someone who could step into that position immediately. And the rebuilding that's been happening over the last 2 years will be completely undone. I think we're already seeing the start of that from the first 2 days of this test match in New Zealand. This is a team that were informed some of them will be forced to testify at this disciplinary, and they look completely out of it. And I just think that the repercussions for a game, you know, cricket in this country is at the moment trying to renegotiate agreements with television broadcasters like SuperSport. If that doesn't go well and there's no money coming into the game, it means that grassroots level, it means that all the development programs, women's cricket, which has only been professional for 8 years in this country, will all suffer. So the consequences could be quite big and detrimental in that way. And I think maybe in the long term, as Ashwin was saying, it's going to result in these conversations happening more openly. And hopefully we're not going to get the dressing room culture that we've had in the past, because I do think that is a really problematic culture. And they got away with it also because they were the number 1 team in the world. And that golden generation has now been tainted with these horrible accusations of discrimination, which I think come from race, but also come from, there's a classism element to it. You know, there's a who you know and who you mix with, who you trust to play in your team, why you trusted Dean Elgar instead of a Kaya Zondo. You know, it might be racial, but it's also just what you're familiar with, and what you're familiar with is race-based in this country, of people of a certain age, I suppose. So I'm not seeing too many positives immediately. And I hope in the long term, if there is a cricket that goes on in this country, that it'll go on better. You know, people you talk to who are involved in the game, deeply, deeply entrenched in the administration, have gone through waves of depression over the last few years. And I think this is the worst one, where they really are thinking that there may not be much left after this, because money is leaving. The organization can't find a CEO. People don't want to be involved with cricket. Sponsors are leaving. The global world of cricket sees South Africa as something of a joke. And there's internal fighting. And this could have been handled a lot better if the process had involved those things we spoke about earlier, like cross-examination. Not the best picture right now.
Thank you, Ms. Moonda. We have a couple more minutes. So I have another question for Professor Desai. I think we can address a couple of questions from Sharda Ugra, who asks Professor Desai what is his take on the Indian situation with regard to access and discrimination? And is the IPL an all-purpose meritocratic band-aid that reduces all the scars?
Well, I just don't know enough to comment. I just know that, there's this lovely line that every suture opens new wounds. Every stitch that we cover up opens some other debate, which is great about society. And I think for me personally, in steeping myself in the history of Indians coming to South Africa from 1860. One of the things that happened in South Africa, which has been chronicled, is that for every 6 men, there was 1 woman. And if you wanted to be a casteist, well, you just won't marry and you would die. And just through the sheer nature of the plantation system and the sheer nature of the migration to South Africa, caste was put on a back foot. And caste was cast aside in many ways. And that for us, people always say, what can India teach us? But I think what happened on the plantations and what happened through our history was a sense of what we can teach people in India about how one lives, how one interacts with people of different religions, different castes, different races. And this small population, linked themselves in the Indian congresses to the Freedom Charter and gave themselves to the liberation of a total South Africa. There's something quite beautiful about the story, a major African journey. And so sometimes we are a living example of maybe what we can show India and about prejudice that is based on birth, prejudice and discrimination that is based, that you're marked for life because of a particular situation you're born in, because we received that on our bodies and we felt it on our bodies. And we felt it when we read the histories of our grandmothers and grandfathers who were relocated in this country 4, 5, 6 times. Just when they built something, they were sent out by the colonial and apartheid governments. So in that sense, I look back at where one might have originated from, and to think also, humbly in my own way, if my forebears stayed in India, my mother and father would never have met. My mother, her can't really trace it, but comes from what is Pondicherry then, from the south. My father from Gujarat, his family, and there's something beautiful that we can offer the world also. That out of the ravages of this kind of deep racial division, that we're able to build some new culture in its own way. So that's what I can say back to the IPL. That is why we take these issues so seriously. Why we're also always on edge about it, because our history of race is just yesterday, and it's always around the corner for us to meet again. And I hope we can bring that into even the IPL, even into Indian cricket, the sensitivity about difference and how you mediate and live with difference.
Thank you, Professor Desai. We have one more question from Sharda Ugra to Ms. Moonda, who asks if there have been any discussions about the toxic masculinity in the past few months.
I think that's a really important question, primarily because the answer to that is no. That is one thing that is being completely overlooked, even though I think it's such a core reason that we are in the situation that we are in terms of conduct. And especially, I think a lot of it stems from the schools culture, which we spoke about. So elite schools produce most of our cricketers. There are about 25 schools in this country where most of the men's national cricketers are produced. The women's team come from a variety of backgrounds. And in fact, we didn't really get much testimony from women at the SJN. There was one former female cricketer who spoke about her experience and one team manager of a women's team who spoke about her experience. But beyond that, there wasn't much in the way of female participation at the SJN. And this idea that the school culture and the boys' club culture, even the club cricket culture, and I'm talking about a lot of the white clubs, obviously things would have happened differently in other areas. It's very centered around these ideas of hierarchy and the ideas of initiation. A new person into the team has to carry the bags or wipe people's shoes or other terrible things. And then the fines meeting culture, which would have dominated the national side. They still hold fines meetings. I was explaining to a colleague of mine on our India desk I've worked there now 15 years and he didn't even know what a fines meeting was. And I had to explain, it's really where players get together after the day's play and fine each other for anything silly that may have happened on the field, like dropping a catch or stepping on your stumps or having your shirt that's dirty. And your fine is to down usually a beer, but obviously there are people who don't drink beer. And then you're downing things like milk with Worcester sauce and Coca-Cola with like chili flakes sprinkled in it. There's some really weird stuff that happens. And it's a forced culture. And I've sat in many a fines meeting. I used to be a scorer in club cricket, where you'd have young schoolboys vomiting over the balconies because they've now been forced to drink beers and then being told it's normal and being laughed at. And then in a few years' time, they're the ones forcing the next generation to drink the beers and vomit over the balcony. And it's just not a culture that encourages difference. It's not a culture that encourages individuality. It's all about uniforms. It's all about the big lager mentality and the us and them. It's not very inclusive. It's not very inviting. I mean, it's one of the reasons I think that we haven't had a male cricketer come out as gay. And that's around the world, right? We know that women's cricket is open to different sexualities, and we just don't have that in the men's game. And more so in a very masculine place like South Africa, where, we're still having discussions about vegetarianism. The other day, there was a cricketer in the dressing room who wanted a vegan meal, and that gets sniggered at because, we're such a meat-eating country that if you have chicken, somebody thinks something's wrong with you. So it's a really... we are at the very base level of this discussion. And I think it's the root cause of a lot of these problems. We need to understand, why do we still have this culture, especially in sports teams? And I understand that there's a unifying element. But, surely there are many other things that they can do that don't have to involve bullying, because it's a culture of bullying that builds, but then also you build something that everybody's too scared to break away from. And Chandan, I think it's such an important conversation. It's one we haven't even touched yet. So maybe, in time that will come, I hope.
Thank you, Ms. Moonda.
Thank you.
So Mr. Manu Chakravarti asks if you could comment on the nature of the inquiry concerning Hansi Cronje and him invoking the devil.
Who's that? Hansi Cronje. The to go around in South Africa is that the whole thing was, as the person who asked the question, is that there was a counter sort of move made by Ali Bakr et al. To say that poor Hansi, this great Christian, the Bible thumper, what would Jesus do as he wore on his wristband, was corrupted by the evil Indians in Eden Gardens, part of the original sin, and part of the counter joke in South Africa was that the one province, Indians were not allowed to live in the so-called Orange Free State. It was called the Orange Free State, but Indians could never live in the Free State. And if you wanted to live, there were few. You had to reclassify yourself either as a colored or as a Chinese. So if you were Singh, S-I-N-G-H, you left the H and you became S-I-N-G and had a Chinese dealer shop. And so the joke was that poor Hansi, he never met any Indians in his whole life because, of course, he comes from Bloemfontein in the Free State. The first time he meets is when he comes to you guys, the devil incarnate, the non-believers. Because remember, in South Africa, for a long time, if you were Muslim or Hindu, you were stamped as a heathen. Those religions were not recognized. Indentured laborers were regarded as heathens for their religion. There he meets the heathens, the quintessential Eves of the world, and he falls victim. And that's South Africa. White people have lorded it over us for 300 years, but they're victims. It's like your Brahmins. The Brahmins have lorded it over. Now they have to, contend with losing a few places at the university, and they're going to burn themselves, right? So, here we have that too, so that was the story, and but it also points to more serious what Firdose said, is that how this culture of silence, this culture that he could go to a hotel room and openly say, let's be corrupt, let's throw a game, and it never came out, and what does it say about that masculinity, that sense of the private school, the old Thai network? Even the great journalists knew about it, but they decided to keep quiet about it. And so it just shows what a kind, beneath the civilized whites who are bringing this kind of way of living to us, the barbaric non-whites of South Africa. Look what they were like when you entered that dressing room. And so in a sense, it's, when South Africa, if a black person gets found out, they'll always say the corrupt so and so. But in South Africa, you'll never hear the corrupt Hansi Cronje. It's just, that word is taken out, it's sanitized completely. And the people who were culpable with him, who even by their silence were complicit. In fact, some of them made calculations and thought, how much will this turn out to be? They actually said these things, became big guys in South African cricket. Dave Richardson became, I think, something in the ICC, and he was in this meeting, but they never told on each other. The code of silence. So, that's South Africa. Though those who sin are seen as sanctimonious if you have a white skin. And so don't take it too seriously. I don't know who asked that, Ramachandra or whatever, the devil always comes dressed in white.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you, Professor.
No more questions, right?
Yeah, I think this brings us.
I'm feeling somewhat selfish about using it up before we close. Firdose, this question is to you. I remember from an article you wrote, Necessary but Inadequate, on the SGN report. You talked about 3 players of color who had privately admitted, who had admitted to being discriminated against, but who didn't show up at the hearings. And you wish they had. And do you have any reason? Can you speculate why they may not have come?
I had to really think hard about the 3 I was talking about. So can I name them? It was Makhaya Ntini, Vernon Philander, and Hashim Amla, who did not appear. Makhaya Ntini, I have a speculation in that Makhaya made a lot of statements on public radio and television. Some of those were paid interviews. And I know that when Makhaya was asked about repeating or coming onto different platforms to make those statements, he wasn't willing to do that. So I don't know if that was a motivation for him, but I know Makhaya Ntini quite well, and I've had several conversations with him over many years about discrimination. And he's definitely experienced a lot of it. And also English is not his first language. He doesn't always feel comfortable speaking to people in that particular language, but of course there are things you can do about that in terms of translation. And I think it was a mixture of discomfort and the fact that he had already kind of given paid interviews on that subject matter. Vernon Philander, I'm not sure. I only know that he said on a television program earlier this week, actually, when he was talking about the team taking a knee, he was quite strong in saying he doesn't believe that they should be forced to, but that they should be required to all explain their decisions, and that they should come and say, I'm doing this because of this, I'm not doing this because of this, and this is the way that we view things. So I think he's maybe a little bit contrarian, and maybe his viewpoint was a little bit different to what was the narrative at the time. And Hashim Amla, I honestly have absolutely no idea. Hashim Amla has been very open and very public in talking about the experiences of being different. And I remember at some point he said, you don't look like someone like me, with obviously his majestic beard, and not feel as though you're an outsider in parts of this world. So Hashim Amla knows what it's like to be discriminated against. He's been open about that. Ashwin spoke about his backlift, about all those kinds of things. I wish he had come, and I wish we could have heard from him. And I hope that in the future we hear from the 3 of them.
Thanks a lot for those. Thank you, Professor Desai. It was scintillating discussion. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I'm sure the audience did as well. Thank you very much again to BIC and to Sports Law and Policy Center for organizing this terrific panel.
Thank you, Professor Desai. Thank you, Ms. Moonda. Thank you, Mr.
Thanks,
Chandan.
Yogita. It was great. Thank you. I don't even say goodbye now. See you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you so much for taking your
Thank you
time
very
off this evening and
Bye.
giving us
Bye.
your valuable perspective. I think thank you to all our viewers as well for joining us this evening. This brings us to the end of our session, and the Sports Law and Policy Center and the PIC look forward to hosting you all again very soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Thank you.